So welcome everyone to our first plenary session. Joining us on the live Zoom are our Summer Research Institute participants, plus we are also live streaming to all of our online speaker series attendees. I'm Susan Bauer-Wu, president of the Mind and Life Institute, and it's a huge honor and gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Christiana Figueres, who is joining us today from Costa Rica. Welcome, Christiana. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to, I'm sure, an interesting conversation today.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. So Christiana was the executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and she is well known for her role in delivering the historic Paris Agreement. We are thrilled Christiana is here to kick off our week, and I encourage you to read her full bio on the conference platform. I'm eager to dive in to this rich conversation. We'll begin with a one-on-one conversation. And after about a half hour, we'll then take some questions from our Summer Research Institute participants. So let's begin, Christiana. So I'll begin. My first question I'll first lead into to recognize that you are known to have made the impossible happen, to quite literally bring the world together for a climate agreement in Paris after the paralysis in Copenhagen, which were a few failed attempts that you so aptly noted that you had the full responsibility and no authority to pull together this legally binding agreement. You brought together diverse national leaders and leaders of corporations, financial institutions, communities of faith, think tanks, technology providers, and activists, and many with competing geopolitical and economic interests. And you came to the most important agreement for the climate movement to date. Christiana, please share a couple of pivotal strategies that you employed to move that mountain.
Well, thanks, Susan. Yeah, first of all, let me just be very clear that while I had the honor, the privilege to be at the head of those negotiations, this was truly an effort of thousands of people. Okay, so that's the first thing that has to be clarified. But a couple of things that I can share. I think, as you said, doing the impossible. I think one of the things that was really important right from the beginning, as I inherited the failure of Copenhagen and was told, well, go look in the garbage can to see where that political process is and then see what you can do about it. And very early on, there was a deep realization that branding something or condemning something as impossible would only be a self-perpetuating reality. And that the first thing that had to change here was the mindset. If we assumed, I personally, but then everyone else who was working on this, that we would never be able to get to an agreement. And that's what I said at my first press conference. I said, a journalist said, Ms. Figueres, do you think we will ever have a global agreement? And I said, not in my lifetime. And that when I heard those words come out of my mouth, I decided, whoa, that's got to change. Because if we do not have a global structure that is going to lead us to addressing climate change, we're condemning humanity to misery unlike any we've ever experienced. And I said, no way are we going to make that a reality. That's only a reality in our head. We have to make a different reality through changing what is in our mindset. And so to understand that what was thought to be impossible is actually, as the mantra, that we all adopted, impossible is not a fact. It's an attitude. It's a mindset. That's all it is. And therefore, if we change our attitude and we change the mindset and we say, right, we're going to take something that seems impossible, we're going to begin to deconstruct that and make it likely, probable, and continue feeding that until it becomes unstoppable and then turns into a reality. So for me, the big lesson there, Susan, is the power of our mind, to create a reality that is different than the reality that we're experiencing today. So not to take the reality that we're experiencing today, and that goes for us right now in this post-COVID time, not to take that as a reality that we're condemned to, but rather to have a much, much more focused mind that is able to leap over the reality that we're in and really truly adhere to a different reality that we know we have to create, and then garner everything that we have, all of our energy, all of our tool sets, that everyone has a different tool set, and truly collaborate together to build a different reality. And that was true then, and it is true now. It is frankly an eternal truth that we can create the reality that we know is a better reality for ourselves, but especially for generations that are going to follow us.
Wow. Thank you, Christiana. That strategy, what we all can do, that is something every single person on this planet has the ability to change our mindset, right? That's really powerful. And so you speak about the term that you write about and you speak about is stubborn optimism. And you key in your book, which I absolutely highly recommend and thoroughly enjoyed, The Future We Choose. And please share with us, what do you mean by stubborn optimism, and how is it different from regular optimism? And how, maybe a little bit more specific to what you just said, how is this kind of optimism helpful to generate collective action for the times we're in related to the climate crisis?
Yeah, well, thanks, Susan, because it is one of the pillars of that book, and in fact, one of the pillars of, well, adopting finally the Paris Agreement, but also one of the pillars that we continue to use today in our struggle to address climate change, and in fact, in our daily struggle, because there is no such thing as we are one kind of a person in our daily life, and then for our profession or to adopt or to affect the outside life, or in my case, the global level. You have to be able to align all of that. There's no way that you can have any impact unless you're aligned. And so the alignment for me and for those that work with me is around this stubborn optimism. And so it has two components. First, let me start with the optimism piece. And let me say what we don't mean by optimism. We don't mean a naive, assumption that everything's going to be fine, I don't have to do anything about it. That's totally irresponsible. We also don't mean, blinding ourselves to science. We are very, very up to date with everything that science is telling us, as well as with the impacts that we're already having from climate change. So it's not that we're denying that. For us, optimism is something different. Optimism is a very deliberate choice that we have to make every single day to face whatever is in front of us, be it our daily life, our relationships with our loved ones, or the global planetary crisis, face it with an optimism that is an input into that challenge, not the result of having achieved something. That's not optimism. That's a celebration. And frankly, we don't celebrate enough. So we should celebrate more. But optimism for us is not the result of success or the result of an achievement. It's the input with which we go into a challenge. And it's pretty simple, right? If I decide, okay, I would like to run a marathon, but then I tell myself, well, but I can't really do it, then I probably won't be able to do it. If I decide I want to run a marathon and here's how I'm going to plan for it, here is how I'm going to train myself, and you have a positive, optimistic attitude to it, you stand a much better chance. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed success, but you definitely improve your likelihood of being able to do whatever it is that you have in mind. And so that's the optimism for us, is to have a positive a mental framework that whatever the challenge is that you have in front of you, whether it's personal, professional, relationship, or global, that we actually do have the wherewithal and the ingenuity to be able to address that. Now, we call it stubborn optimism, Susan, because predictably, it's going to be tough. This is not easy. If it were easy, we would have solved it when we first knew about climate change, which was 50 years ago. And so this is a tough challenge, and we are going to have barriers. We are going to stumble on our path, but we have to be stubborn. We can't give up just because we, bang ourselves against a door. Doesn't mean that we then sit back and go, okay, well, then I'm not going to do anything about it. You have to be stubborn in your determination. There has to be a true, determined attitude that, yeah, it's going to be difficult, but by God, we are going to do this. So that's why we call it stubborn optimism. And we have seen in our experience, and we continue to experience, that kind of a mindset, that kind of an attitude toward anything that is in front of us is, as I say, not a guarantee, but it certainly helps to move us forward.
Wow, that's very, very inspiring. Gives us the recognition that if we can feel empowered, we can then begin to do the action that's needed. And I want to transition now to a little bit more personal. You've mentioned before that the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh have saved your life and were the guiding light for your work for the Paris Agreement, helping you to muster the strength, compassion, and focus that you needed to do the job. Can you tell us more about that and perhaps share with us how contemplative wisdom can inform all our lives as we continue our work in addressing the climate crisis?
Well, it's obviously a very personal experience that everyone walks their own paths. So there's no way that I would like to imply that my path is the path that anyone else is sharing, because luckily we're all so unique, and we all walk hopefully in the same direction, but through different paths. But when I say that the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh saved my life, I actually mean it very literally, because on the side of my professional work and working with 195 governments to build the Paris Agreement, at a few years before we reached that, I was dealt a very deep blow by my former husband, who shared with me that he actually, for the past 25 years, which we had been married, had been having a completely separate life to the one that he shared with me and with our daughters. And I was beyond shocked. I was just cast into the deepest dark hole, because I had come from a broken marriage from my parents, and I had decided that I would have the perfect marriage, and I did all the therapy that I felt I needed to in order to go into a marriage relationship, and then I gave that marriage 100%. And then to be dealt that blow, I literally became suicidal, because I thought, that's it, right? I mean, yes, my profession is important, but much more important is who we are as a family. And to be dealt that blow, I just thought, okay, well, then what's the point here? And so I literally became suicidal. And then in some moment of enlightenment, I thought, this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. A, because I have 2 daughters, and B, because I'm working toward a global agreement. So this is probably not a good idea. And the universe conspired to bring me the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh. I had never heard about him before. I had never studied Buddhism. I even had, when the first idea came into my mind and my mental reality, I didn't even know how do you really spell Buddhism? Hold on. Wait a second, how do you spell that? Because it was so far away from my reality. And I was so blessed to be, out of the universe, truly conspired. And I just delved into Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings at one of his monasteries until I pulled myself out by realizing that, first of all, there's nothing permanent. And so the lesson of impermanence, that everything is changing all the time, and that I went into a marriage thinking that it was going to be permanent because I wanted it to be permanent, and I wanted it to be permanently perfect. And letting go of that idea was very difficult, but was key to me pulling myself out of that dark hole. And I kept on telling my daughters, well, I'm building a ladder for myself. I am climbing, a little rung and then another one. And sometimes I fell down the rung, but I built a ladder for myself, a mental and spiritual ladder for myself, that slowly allowed me to walk myself or crawl myself out of that hole. And so his teachings literally saved my life. And then step number 2 is that the understanding that came for me through the study of Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings was so helpful in guiding those negotiations. And I literally saw every single day how there was a reflection between where I was in my head and my heart every single day, and how that got reflected into the negotiations of that day or that week. And I literally then understood that all of my political training and my facilitator training and my climate change understanding and all of that was important, but much more critical was who was I being? What was the light that I was shining on this? And what were the thoughts that I was entertaining? Because again, the thoughts that I was entertaining, I could actually see them turn into reality in the negotiations. And so that completely indivisible link between who we are, what we think, what we are, what reality do we have inside ourselves, and the reality that we are then able to allow to emerge and to elicit in front of us is just so powerful. And I just saw it slowly start in front of me, but then it became just the way to work. And I'm truly grateful. I'm so grateful for that lesson that, that first saved my physical life, and then saved my spiritual life, I guess.
Thank you, Christiana. Deep gratitude for sharing your personal story. Very, very meaningful. Actually, my next question relates to stories. And you've experienced the power of local stories the narrative of places, and how they positively contribute to environmental activism. One of the topics we are exploring intentionally and creating spaces this week is to share stories around climate change. Love to hear your thoughts on why do you think stories matter?
I think stories matter in general because we as humans relate directly to stories, whether they are verbal stories or visual stories. I'm a very much of a visual person, and I see a story in, whatever I'm looking at right now. If I'm not looking at you, Susan, and everyone else, I just look out there and I see the Pacific Ocean. And that to me is a story. Or we can tell stories with our words. And the reason why they're so important is because we can relate so much better to stories. It's when you work on climate change, it's very difficult to put out the complexity of climate if you resort to numbers or to graphs or to trajectories or tables. Very difficult. But if you tell it as a story, then it actually humanizes. It makes it much more human. And then we can really understand what is going on. And actually, Susan, I'm so glad that we're doing this today, because the most amazing documentary, which to me is a story of climate change, has just come out on Netflix, and I really want to support and encourage everyone to see this documentary. It's called Breaking Boundaries. It's on Netflix. It came out on June 4th. It is the most important documentary that has ever been made, without a doubt. And do see this documentary, because it is the most compelling story I have ever seen, and the most understandable story on what is happening on our planet. I very much recommend that you watch this. And here's the deal: watch it with someone who is younger than you. Because what we're doing to our planet, and this is about all ecosystems, this is beyond climate change, is we have to understand that what we're doing to our planet, we're doing to generations that are coming. And that documentary, to me, Susan, is the most compelling story, because it tells the story of what we're doing. It shows us the story visually. And it just goes straight to the most important part of us. Beyond what our head comprehends, it really goes to aligning head, heart, and soul. And that's why I think stories are so powerful, because they reach beyond our head, beyond our mind. They go much deeper, and they are able to elicit and touch many different parts of us that then become aligned. And then we can decide, so do I do something about this or not? But you have been touched in many different parts of you.
Breaking Boundaries. That's the name of the film. Okay, we will all check it out very soon. Your book, which I showed before, The Future We Choose, that you co-authored, it was co-authored with Tom Rivett-Carnac. The Future We Choose was written before the pandemic and was published last year. What has been the response to your book, and would you add anything to it if you were writing it right now?
It's been an interesting response to the book, because it's a book that's a little bit unusual about climate change. It's not, it certainly borrows and incorporates a lot of the climate science, because all policy, I believe, has to be science-based. But it's very much written from the perspective of, let's examine what is the relationship between who we are as individuals, who we understand ourselves to be as actors on this planet at this moment in history, and the climate crisis. So it's very much about the direct relationship between us as individuals and the home that we all share, because there is a direct link there. And, you know, we tend to forget that every gulp of water that we drink comes from nature. Every molecule of air that we breathe comes from nature, and every morsel of food that we eat comes from nature. So there's a totally direct link, a survival link between us and nature, and we tend to forget that. But if on top of that you add, and not only is there a direct physical link, but there is a direct spiritual link between who we are and who we understand ourselves to be and our role at this moment in the evolution of mankind, then you get a really powerful vector there of forces that come together that allow you to be an active agent of change. And so that's what the book is about. It's understanding who you are in this moment, understand the science, and stand up with all of your power to contribute to addressing climate change, so that we can all together create the future that we want for those who are coming after us, and not be simply irresponsible, irresponsible free riders on a planet that would lead us to unacceptable human misery. So that's, the book is about that. I wrote it with Tom Karnak, who was my colleague at the United Nations when we were working toward the Paris Agreement. I hired Tom to come in and help me with political strategy. The reason why I hired him is because he had been a Buddhist monk before that. And I thought, right, here I am practicing the Buddhism that I am understanding from Thich Nhat Hanh. I really want someone who has the same, share my responsibility here, but comes with the same vision, same clarity of thought and acting. So Tom is much, much younger than I, but we got to be a really good team, and we continue to work together now because we're both moved by this. We're both centered in that very strong correlationship between who we are, who we understand ourselves to be, how do we turn up in the world, and then what is the consequence that we're able to elicit and see emerge in front of us. Mm-hmm. And the book has been really wonderfully received. It's been translated, I think, now to 14 different languages. And so we continue to hear from people who are understanding the climate crisis from a deeper point of view, not just from emissions of CO2, but what else is there to understand there.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question, Christiana, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So from both health and sustainability perspectives, we know that walking and biking are preferable to driving and flying. And similarly, diets based on plant foods are healthier, more sustainable than diets high in meat and dairy. And we know that many people choose to continue less healthy and unsustainable lifestyles. What are your thoughts on what might help them change?
Well, it's a good question. And it's a question actually that you can ask about so many different things, right? Because our habits, our daily habits, are not necessarily the best for us or for the planet. And so for me, it's all about questioning, not judging someone, because I don't know why someone continues to eat meat. I just simply don't know. So my approach there is one of honest interest, curiosity, if you will. Tell me what happens for you before you eat the meat, while you're eating the meat, after you eat the meat. Just let me into your reality. And I have found that coming with honest and sincere curiosity and questioning is very powerful, because the moment that we lift a blaming finger, right? Well, you are not doing the right thing. That's it. You finish that conversation. Nowhere can you get any farther than that. Mm-hmm. And whereas if you go without judgment to truly understand, and people have those habits out of different reasons, and those are reasons that we have to respect. And then you can continue asking questions. And what if you changed this? What if you did this? How would that affect your life? So to bring people on a mental journey without blaming them, I think blaming and making people feel guilty is so unhelpful. And I believe that that's true on an individual level. And it is definitely true on a global level. If I had paraded myself around while I was trying to get everyone to agree to the Paris Agreement to 195 different countries and use a blaming attitude toward those that are emitting most, I would never have gotten them on board, because they will immediately go into the defensive. So it's not about blaming. It's not about making people feel guilty, or governments or corporations. It's about tell me what that is for you in your life, and then take them on a mental journey that hopefully will help them to change a little bit, and sometimes more than a little bit.
Thank you. Very, very wise, very, very simple, not as scary as it seems to a lot of us. So we're going to transition now. We have a lot of questions that are coming in, and we only have about 20 minutes for them. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. So our Summer Research Institute participants are going to ask questions that our team has curated. And we have some with a lot of hands raised. Oh gosh. And those of you that are on the
good luck, Susan.
I know. That are going to the speaker series, folks can continue with discussion on your conference platform and listen to the questions being asked. So I have a written question. That was the top one here. I'm just going to ask you. It's from Kua Minigu, who basically says this: I live in a rural community of 5,000 people. I'm a member of our local Climate Action Society and working to start a conversation about local mitigation and adaptation possibilities locally. I was surprised to learn that this is underscored. Bringing up the topic of climate change is like talking about death at a baby shower. Can you suggest ways to soften that wall at the town level?
Yeah, first thing, don't say climate change. I've often said, I've never tattooed climate change here on my forehead. You can end up there, but it's not necessary, because it is scary to many people, because they feel so disempowered and so helpless, or because they've bought into the, really ridiculous partisan political ideology of it. So it's not about that. It's about quality of life. It's about quality of life today, as well as quality of life tomorrow. And so, quality of life as expressed today in what we eat, in our exercise routine, in how we transport ourselves. It's also about your pocketbook, because if you live, and I don't know where this town is, whether it's in an area in the United States that needs both heating and cooling, depending on what kind of season. If you haven't properly insulated your home, well, then you are paying a lot of electricity to heat and cool everybody else's territory or the park in front of your house. And so for me, or it's about your money. If your money is invested today, if you have savings, and those savings are in high carbon assets, well, you probably will lose your money. So it's about putting yourself in the shoes of these people and understanding what's important to them. For some people, who've worked really hard and have their savings there and are really, really depending on those savings, it's about how are you protecting those assets. For someone who is very much more concerned about their personal health right now, well, let's talk about your health. And how can you do better? How can you grow? The town could grow some of its own food. You can begin to move toward much healthier things. So it's always, I call that contextual communication. It's about finding out what is important for the person that you're talking to. I don't go to a big meeting of hedge fund investors and speak the way I've spoken to you today. That's not going to make any sense to them. To them, I have hard economic, financial arguments, and I have numbers that I throw at them because that's what's important to them. If I came here to you and I started, hitting you with numbers of investments and portfolio values, et cetera, you go like, what is this woman talking about? So it's very important to understand what is critically important, what is important to the person you're speaking to. Put yourself in that person's shoes. What is important? What are the things that that person holds dear, and you can get them to change their habits and their attitudes without ever saying the word climate change. And frankly, that's probably better. Nobody needs, anybody to walk around with climate change tattooed on their forehead, starting with me. What we need is changes of behavior and changes of decision and changes of attitude. And so let's do it that way.
Wonderful. Thank you. All so wise and so helpful. I'm going to invite one of the many hands that are raised. We'll start doing that. Someone named Kumanga, is that how you pronounce your name? Okay, maybe, would you like to voice your question? So I think you will be unmuted. Somebody will assist you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Susan. Hi,
Hello.
Christina. Hi. I'm joining everyone from Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to connect this way. My question to Christina is, what is your motivation behind the amazing work that you've been doing for a long time, especially sitting in Sri Lanka right now, where we are experiencing a very huge marine disaster? I would love to hear your motivation to take some inspiration from you, to take action and do something about what's happening in Sri Lanka right now. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kumanga. What an important question. And everybody needs to, decide what the motivation is for them, and everyone will be motivated by a different factor. For me, my motivation is I have two daughters in their early 30s, and I obviously want to give them the best future that I can. But my two daughters have always represented, for me, way beyond the two of them. They have represented future generations. And so every time I look at them, obviously I love them to pieces, but I see beyond them. And I know that there are many generations of men and women who are coming after them. In fact, I should share with you that for a long time, I had a recurrent dream of 7 pairs of eyes. They were all little eyes. They were all black little eyes. And these black little eyes used to ask me, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I had that dream recurrently. And I kept on thinking, what is this? What is this dream? And then I understood it's 7 generations. 7 generations of children after me, 7 generations who are the 7 generations that are going to be affected by climate change. And those 7 generations were asking me, what did you do? What are you doing? And the fact is, Kumanga, those 7 generations are asking all of us today, every single adult is being asked, because we have millions of kids on the streets, and they're all asking us the same question: what are you doing? And we have that responsibility toward those 7 generations. So that is my motivation. My motivation is 7 pairs of little eyes.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm going to go to another hand that's raised, and it's Christoph. Would you like to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm in. Okay, good. Thank you, Christiana, in particular, for sharing your very personal story. I'm really touched. And I have a question about the negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement, in particular with the kind of difficult stakeholders, like, for example, the countries that are like for their economic survival depending on like fossil fuels currently. How did you manage to be true to your values and the way that this agreement needed to go and the process needed to go, and at the same time maintain the trust between yourself and these kind of difficult parties? How did you manage that?
Yeah, Christoph, thank you for that question. So I guess I would like to take the example of oil and gas exporting countries around the Gulf states, because that's where most of our oil and gas comes from. And these are states that were in poverty just 1 generation ago. And when they discovered oil and gas, they all of a sudden catapulted themselves to be some of the richest nations. And that's all they do, right? Take Saudi Arabia. That's the only source of its wealth is the export of oil and gas, and they totally depend on that. So you can imagine that, you know, any idea of starting to reduce oil and gas in our economy is a huge threat to them. But I also understood that that is their current reality. They, you know, it is not their fault. I cannot hold them and hold them responsible for having discovered that resource under their feet. That's the way it happened. You know, all those dinosaurs died there and millions of years ago, and they discovered that. So I don't hold them responsible for that. I hold them responsible for what they're going to do in the future. That's different, not for what they have done in the past. And so my conversation with them was always about the future, not blaming them for the past, but always about the future. And how do they see themselves 10, 20 years from now? Yes, they have made a lot of money out of oil and gas, but is that really going to be the important thing for them 10, 20, 30 years ago? They are today already in one of the hottest areas of the planet. And if we continue to warm, that whole area will be rendered practically uninhabitable. So it doesn't matter how much money they've made, they would not be able to enjoy their home. So at some point, the accumulation of money just doesn't cut it anymore. And they know that. They, you know, through many conversations, they were able to understand that and understand that that it is also in their long-term interest to address climate change, just because their survival is based on that. And so after many conversations in which I was asking questions, but not blaming them, just asking them. So, you know, paint for me, paint, give me the picture of your economy 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. How are your people going to be living? Where's the water going to come from? Where's the food going to come from? And so, you know, they understood that. And so Saudi Arabia was one of the first. oil and gas exporting countries that started a very hefty program to diversify its economy, because they will have to move, or they're already moving away from oil and gas, perhaps not as quickly as most of us would want, but they are aware of that. So for me, the question, the challenge, as I said, was not to confront them, not to put them into, the black box of forever guilt, but rather to invite them out of that box into paint for me the future that you want to see for your children, your grandchildren, and generations after that. What are you creating for them? And that puts them in a very different spot. And the amazing thing about this is that if you take people to the future, that future coincides for everyone. Right now, we're living different realities, right? But eventually, the future coincides for all of us, because we're all on this tiny, tiny little planet. And there's no such thing as, well, some are going to be completely saved and others are not. It is true that there are some that live in more privileged conditions and will be mitigated from some of these impacts, but they cannot be protected from the impacts. So eventually, we all understood that it's in our common interest.
Thank you, Christiana. And thank you, Christoph, for the question. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask Emily to speak it. So Emily.
Hi, thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much. This has all been incredible. So my name's Emily. I'm a youth climate organizer with Sunrise Movement. I've been in the climate movement forever. And something that I'm really noticing as problematic to the way in which we talk about environmentalism is that, especially in the US, there's such a heavy focus on individual responsibility. So this is also kind of a follow-up question to what someone asked earlier about individuals changing their diet. Of course, it's really important that individuals change their diet and recycle and takes the steps that they can do. But to me, I feel like because we have shifted the focus so much to individuals, it sort of creates the conditions for the collective to not be held to the same responsibility and for corporations to not be challenged as much. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, on how, if you notice the same thing about there being like a too heavy focus on individual responsibility and not enough of like a collective vision, which is also like quite a neoliberal framework. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that, if you've noticed that, and how you work through that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. That's a really important question. And the fact is that, at least from where I sit, it's actually completely the opposite. So from where I sit, but that's just because that's what I'm exposed to, I see government after government taking more and more responsibility, the US government being the latest example, but you have a long slew there of governments that are taking responsibility. In fact, 70%, sorry, I'm going to hit you now with a number, 70% of the global GDP on this planet is already under zero net emissions pathways by 2050, which is what is the requisite pathway in the Paris Agreement. So it doesn't mean that everyone is there, because 70% is not 100%, but that's an impressive majority of countries that have already, under what we call the Paris effect, have already understood that they need to put those policies in place. You also see a shift in corporations. You see, we now have 4,000 corporations and counting that have understood that they have a huge responsibility here, that their bottom lines also depend on this, and that they have to be able, if they're going to continue as corporations, and there's no guarantee that they will, that they have to actually put out there the products and services that their customers are going to want. And their customers are usually, their customers are increasingly, not usually, increasingly young people. So the fact that young people are expecting corporations to be responsible about the environment, to be responsible about social issues, is incredibly helpful, because now you see corporations that are changing. And so for me, from my reality, then that's because I work at that level, at the corporate and government level, I see those things changing radically. So you know that more than 60% of all of the electricity that we produce in the world is already renewable energy, and we will be up to 75% very soon. Most of the new capital that is being invested is into clean technologies. I don't know how many of you saw that there was a takeover of ExxonMobil board of directors, 3 new directors who are climate conscious, because taking over in ExxonMobil, because ExxonMobil has been so completely irresponsible. There was a court decision in Holland that forces Shell as a company to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030. There was a shareholder resolution. All of this happened in the past 7 days. Shareholder resolution that forces Chevron to be responsible, not just for its own emissions, but for the emissions of all of the gas and oil that they produce and sell to you and me. And so, you know, those big picture things are happening, Emily. Not everyone is aware of them, but they are happening. That's why we're saying, and now it's time to mobilize individuals, because the individuals are the staying power. We as individuals, we are the staying power. We are the ones that vote in democratic countries, and hence can continue to have leaders who are climate responsible. We're the ones who, in this capitalistic system, as long as that lasts, and I don't know how long it's going to last, and it hopefully will be substituted by something better, but as long as we're in this capitalist system, we're the ones that purchase products and services. And the more we demand products and services that are low carbon or no carbon, the more those corporations are under pressure. So this is about bringing all 3 forces together: governments, corporates, and individuals, and being able to mobilize those 3 to actually optimize and accelerate the transition that is already occurring, for sure. It is unstoppable, but it has to be accelerated.
Okay, well, on that note, we are going to bring this session to a close. Emily, thank you for the great question. And Christiana, thank you for your response to that question and for everything that you brought to this session. This was just 1 hour together. That was so rich, so inspiring, so powerful. And it's just a perfect way that we're kicking off the week. I want to apologize to all of you whose questions we did not get to. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of questions. So for those of you attending the Summer Research Institute, we have discussion forums that we encourage you to continue the conversation. And I think a lot of these questions will also be coming up with the other speakers throughout the week. So for Christiana, I want to encourage you all to check out The Future We Choose, her book that we've mentioned, as well as her podcast. It's called Outrage and Optimism. So Christiana, keep up the wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Susan. I just wanted to say a word about that podcast. It's a fun podcast. And it's called Outrage and Optimism because we believe that we have to continue being outraged about what we're not doing and haven't done yet. So there's a lot of outrage there, but also optimistic about what we can do. So it's an interesting, balance of both of those. Over time, it's a balance. Sometimes we're more outraged than optimistic, and sometimes more optimistic than outraged. But would love to have you join us on the podcast. Susan, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a delightful conversation. I can see a whole bunch of questions and comments coming through on the chat. I'm so sorry that we didn't get to all of this, but thank you very, very much to all of you, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the next few days.
Thanks. And I will just share some closing comments in terms of what's next. Our next session will be by Dr. Elke Weber, It begins in just over an hour. It's entitled How to Give the Future a Chance, Mind, Earth, and Climate Change. And as will be the practice with all of our plenary and panel sessions, if you're joining as a Summer Research Institute participant on the live Zoom, we welcome you to continue to hang out a bit longer. We're going to keep it open to discuss this session with one another in small breakout groups. And to everyone, thank you for joining us, and see you at the next session. Thanks again, Christiana. Bye-bye.
Bye.